22, and not one door in the world would open for her. That was the whole of Nell Ambrose's situation the morning this began. She had no bed, no bank book, no relative who would answer a knock. What she had was a hat box tied with string, a length of black walnut she'd carried since girlhood, and $10 in mixed coin. $10 bought her a dead boarding house on a mud lane in the tin mining hills of the Idaho panhandle. 3 stories of peeling clapboard that had housed nobody since the mine played out. The neighbors were kind about it, mostly. They told her she'd wasted good money on a fire trap. None of them, though, and no living person for going on 30 years, had any notion of what lay tucked in the dark under the main staircase, waiting. Quick word before we go on. If a story like this one lands with you, tap subscribe and drop a note telling us the town you're watching from. It genuinely lifts us to see how far these travel. Nell Ambrose came into the world in a rooming house, which is a thing worth knowing about her from the start. Her mother, Delia, ran a respectable one in Wallace, down in the Silver Country. 12 rooms always left, and a table that seated 14, and Delia fed miners and drummers and railroad men 3 meals a day for 20 years, and knew every one of them by the way they took their coffee. She had a gift, Delia did, for making a stranger feel he'd come home to a place he'd never been. Nell's father was a name on a marriage line, and little else. Gone to the Coeur d'Alene diggings before Nell could walk, swallowed up the way that country swallowed men who chased the rock. So the house and the mother were the whole of Nell's childhood, and the sound of it, boots on the stairs, the clatter of the long table, a dozen tired men easing into the one warm room in a cold town, was the sound she measured all later quiet against. Some children are marked early by the thing they'll become, though nobody can read the mark until much later. Nell's showed itself in an odd way. At 7, she took to sitting on the 4th stair from the bottom of her mother's staircase, always the 4th, with a slate on her knees, and she kept a ledger of the house. Who was in, who was out, who'd paid, who hadn't, who'd want the room over the kitchen because his chest was bad and the chimney warmed that wall. She wasn't playing at it. She was running it in the private way of a child who has found the exact work her hands were made for years before anyone will let her do it. Delia would find the slate covered in her daughter's careful figuring and laugh and say the Lord had sent her a housekeeper instead of a child. And he'd surely had his reasons. Nell didn't take her meaning. In time she would. The fever of winter came when Nell was 16. It moved through Wallace fast and quietly, and it did not spare the strong, and it took Delia in the space of a single week. Monday she was rolling out pie dough, Sunday she was in the ground. Grief has 2 kinds. There's the sort that thins out over years like smoke off a banked fire, and there's the other sort, the door slammed hard, and that was Nell's. One week she had a mother and a full house. The next she had a house full of men who couldn't very well board with a 16-year-old girl alone, and a bank that held the mortgage, and no way under heaven to carry it. The rooming house was sold to settle what Delia owed. Nell watched the auctioneer's men carry out the long table where 14 had eaten every night of her life, and she did not make a sound because sound would not have helped, and she'd already learned that much. A girl of 16 with no people is a problem a town feels obliged to solve. The banker's family solved it by taking her on as a maid of all work, which was charity dressed as employment, and understood as such by everyone. She scrubbed and laundered and blacked stoves in a house where she was spoken of as though she weren't in the room, and she said little and swallowed less, having learned that a girl who complains in a house that doesn't want her is only giving that house its excuse. But she found her way, in those years, to the one place she loved. There was a widow at the edge of Wallace, old Mrs. Yost, who still kept a boarding table though her legs had mostly quit her, and Nell went to her on her half-days and worked for nothing but the learning. Everett Yost's widow taught Nell the trade from the underside, the parts the boarders never see. How to lay a fire so it holds through a January night without waking to feed it. How to keep a larder against a hard-luck winter, salt and lard and root cellar, so that a full house never went hungry when the passes closed. How to seize a stranger at the door in one look. Who'll pay, who'll skip, who's only cold and needs a night's grace, and will remember you for the rest of his life. And she taught her something the girl kept, that a boarding house isn't a building, it's a promise. Anybody can rent a man a bed, the old woman said once. Working dough with knuckles like walnuts. The trade is giving him a reason to come down to breakfast. Nell would not understand the whole weight of that for years. When she did, it would change everything. She hoarded her coins in a Colgate's cold cream jar, the milk glass kind, its label soaked half away, and she kept it under a loose brick in the banker's washhouse, $30 by 21, near 50 by 22. Then the banker's wife turned up the loose brick one wash day, and the fury that followed had nothing to do with the jar and everything to do with 6 years of a servant girl the house had never wanted underfoot. By nightfall, Nell stood in the road with her hat box and her cold cream jar and the piece of black walnut, and the door shut behind her with a sound she'd been half expecting for 6 years. She was homeless, flat and plain, no gentler word available and none sought. It was Mrs. Yost who set her on the road, in the end, sent word by a teamster before Nell had even decided to go. There was a town 2 valleys north, a tin camp called Ferris, that the mine's closing had gutted, where a great old boarding house stood empty at the top of the street, and the county would sign it over for the price of the back taxes to anyone reckless enough to take it on. If Nell wanted a table of her own to set, the old woman said, that was where to go set it. Nell hadn't meant to go anywhere. But a girl with everything she owns in a hat box and $40-odd in a cream jar hasn't got much to weigh, and so she took the north stage the following dawn. The climb into the panhandle changed the country by degrees. The broad silver valleys narrowed and stood up into timbered ridges, the road threading a river that ran green and loud over its stones. Cedar and hemlock closed overhead until the stage went through a green dusk at midday, and the smell came in at the windows. River water and cedar duff and cut fir, and high up where the trees thinned, the cold, clean nothing of snow that never fully leaves those peaks. A water ousel bobbed on a midstream rock and let the coach pass without minding it. Nell watched the whole ascent with the flat. Storing attention, she gave anything she meant to hold on to. And though she had never once been up that river in her life, the shape of the country came to her strangely familiar, the way you'll sometimes know how a room is furnished before your eyes adjust to the dark. Ferris, at the top of the grade, was a town the tin had made and then let fall. A single steep street of false fronts, more than half boarded, climbing to a mill gone silent above the gulch. Mrs. Yost's cousin met the stage, a big, unhurried man named Booth, who ran the feed store and carried in his head every joist and sill in that valley, and who spent the walk up the street saying next to nothing and letting the cold green evening do the talking. Near the top, where the houses gave out against the black wall of the timber, he stopped and tipped his chin at the largest building on the street and said only, "There. That's what the old woman wrote me you'd be after." The boarding house stood 3 full stories, built when tin was king and Ferris meant to last. A broad, deep, 4-square building of clapboard over good post and beam, a wide porch across its front, and a deep-pitched roof to shed the panhandle snow. Weather had had its way with the skin of it. The paint hung in curls. 2 porch posts had rotted at the foot and let the roofline dip, and the front windows were shuttered blind. but the frame under the ruin was honest. Nell could feel that with a hand flat to the corner post, feel the good dry heart of the fir, mortised and pegged by a builder who'd meant the thing to stand 100 winters. The stone foundation ran deep and level. The great center chimney stood plumb. Whoever raised this house had built it the way Delia had run hers, to keep people warm and safe and fed, and to go on doing it long after he was gone. Whose was it? Nell asked. Booth thought about it. Old fellow named Harlan Pettit. Kept it 40 years, back when the mill ran 3 shifts, and this street was full of men who needed a bed and a hot plate. Best table in the district, they said. A man got off the downshift at midnight, and Pettit have kept his supper warm. Died the winter the tin gave out, and the town emptied. No wife, no children anybody knew of. Counties held it for the taxes ever since. He glanced at her sideways. Comes to $10. Nobody's touched it in 30 years. Folks'll tell you a house that big and that empty has a way of keeping its old borders on, if you follow me. $10, Nell said. $10, said Booth, and more than one pair of hands ought to take on a loan. She counted it out the next morning at the county desk, $10 in mixed coin from the cream jar, sliding it across to a clerk, who looked from the money to the girl and asked gently whether she was sure. Land didn't move for $10. $10 was a winter coat, which meant the thing was either a clerical mistake or a place so far past worthless that nobody in 30 years had wanted it for free. Nell said only that it was what she had and what she wanted, and she signed the deed in the round, careful hand her mother had drilled into her over a boarding house ledger, and the clerk reached into a drawer and laid a heavy iron key on the counter between them, dark with age and cold against her palm. It had sat in that drawer 30 years, he said. It was hers now, and that cold iron key was the first object on the whole earth that belonged to Nell Ambrose, and to no one else living. Still with us? Then do us the one kindness that keeps this channel going. Subscribe before you go on. It matters more than you'd think. Up the street she went that same afternoon, key heavy in her coat pocket, breath smoking in the thin, bright cold. The house, up close, was uglier and sounder than it had looked from below. Uglier because 30 winters of leaked snow had gone to work on the entry floor and left it soft and stained beneath the fanlight, and something had nested in the porch ceiling. Sounder because when she put her back against the newel post at the foot of the great stair and shoved with all she had, not a joint of the frame so much as sighed. She went through the whole place before she'd say a word about it, room by room, 3 floors, and a cellar, the way Mrs. Yost had taught her to size up a house. For the good bones under the bad skin, and the bones of this one were faultless. The builder had built true. The lock had rusted stiff in 30 years, and for a long moment the key wouldn't answer. And she had the cold thought that she'd climbed 2 valleys to own a door that would never let her in. So she eased it, the way you ease anything that's seized from long neglect, a little oil and a little patience, and no force at all. And at last the wards gave with a low iron groan, and the bolt slid home. The door swung in on its shrieking hinges, 30 years of shut air breaking open, and the breath of the place rolled out over her, dust and mouse and cold plaster, and under all of it, the ghost of 1,000 old suppers, wood smoke and coffee and fried onions soaked so deep into the wood that no amount of empty years could scour it out. She stood on the sill with the low sun, throwing her shadow the length of the front hall, and then she stepped across. The hall ran back to the foot of the main staircase, and the stair went up, broad and dim into the shadowed floors above, its banister furred with dust, its treads worn into shallow hollows by 40 years of boarders' boots. The long dining room opened to the right, its great table still standing. Thank God, still standing. Under a shroud of dust, 20 chairs waiting for a supper that had ended 30 years back. A cold range squatted in the kitchen beyond. It was a ruin, but it was standing, and it was hers, and its bones were sound, and turning slowly in the dust of that front hall, Nell felt the shape of a whole possible life come down and fit itself over her the way a mother's hand fits the crown of a child's head. She slept that first night on the soundboards of the dining room, close by the great table, a small, careful fire drawn in the old range, and the timber outside was loud with sounds she'd never heard from a place that was her own. Wind combing the cedars, the river's steady rush far down the gulch, an owl once, and then its answer, and everywhere the small ticks and settlings of a big old house, discovering it wasn't empty anymore. Sleep was long coming. But somewhere past midnight the fear went out of her, and something even-keeled came in to take its place. The feeling, almost, of a full house on a winter night, of being one warm room in a cold country, of not being alone. She started at the bottom of the stairs, because the entry floor was the worst of the rot, and because a stair is the spine of a boarding house, and she meant to know hers. She was pulling the soft, ruined boards from the foot of the staircase, easing them free so as to save the joists, when the pry bar knocked against the closed panel that boxed in the underside of the stair, that dead triangular cupboard beneath the treads that every big house has and nobody ever opens. It answered hollow, not the packed dead hollow of a wall stuffed with a mouse nest of years, but the clean drum of a made space, a room within the room. She rapped it with her knuckles, corner to corner. Somebody had built a cupboard in there, behind a panel, painted to vanish into the wainscot, and then papered over the seam so smooth you'd pass it 1,000 times and call it wall. She sat back on her heels for a long minute in the lantern light. Then she went down the street and fetched Booth, because a body oughtn't open some doors entirely on her own. He came up and studied the papered seam under the stair a good while and rubbed the back of his neck. "Harlan Pettit," he said, low. A boarding house man in a mill town in those days was banker to every miner on the street, held their pay when the saloon would have had it, staked a man to breakfast when the mine ran short, kept more of this valley's cash in his own strongbox than the bank up the road ever did. People always wondered where Pettit's own money got to. Never spent, never banked. Nobody asked. He wasn't the asking kind. He looked at the wall. "I'd say we're about to find where an old man kept his life savings." She cut the paper along the hidden seam and worked the panel loose, and it came away whole, and behind it opened the cupboard under the stairs. Bone dry, close, lined against the damp with sheet tin, the private strong room of a man who'd trusted no bank in a town of failing banks. The lantern light poured in, and along a low shelf built into the back of that triangular dark, ranged from the tall end down to the low, stood a row of small strong boxes, iron-banded, black japanned, each with its little brass hasp, and each she saw as she brought the flame near. Lettered on the end, with a year. The nearest red was 1858. Behind it the years marched back into the narrowing dark, 1859, 1860. 1861. A box for every year the old man had set his table. A little of each year's takings carried in here and shut away while the town outside forgot the house existed. She lifted the first box down. Heavy. That low, dense, particular heaviness that only metal has, that a hand knows before the eye confirms it. She thumbed the stiff hasp back and raised the lid. Coin gold uppermost, bedded in oilcloth gone hard as slate. Eagles and half-eagles, the milling still crisp under a skin of dust. Silver beneath, dollars rubbed smooth in the pockets of dead miners. And down under the coin, pressed flat and tied in bundles, the paper money of the boom. Mill scrip and greenbacks banded in twine. Box after box along that hidden shelf, one for each year the old man had kept his promise to the men who came down to his breakfast. A portion of every year folded away in the tin-lined dark. Some boxes were fat, The one marked 1872, a top year for the mill, would barely close. Some were nearly flat. 1865, a bad luck winter, held 2 coins and a folded supper menu, of all things penciled in a shaky hand. 40-odd boxes, all told. 40-odd winters of a careful man keeping something back against a rainy day. That, for him, never came. Nell sat down on the cold entry floor with a gold eagle lying bright in her palm, and her throat closed, and her eyes stung, and she pressed the back of her wrist hard against her mouth and got the better of it. Booth said nothing at all. It wasn't a thing that wanted words. They counted the better part of 2 days, the two of them, and when a straight-dealing coin man had come up on the freight from the county seat and weighed the gold on his own balance and named her honest figures, the sum of it, gold, silver, and scrip together, came to something better than $11,000. More money than Nell Ambrose had let herself picture holding in the whole run of a life. And still, it wasn't the money that broke her open. In the last box, the low one at the narrow end of the shelf, under the final bundle of oilcloth lay a flat packet, and inside it a little sheaf of old boarding house receipts tied with kitchen string, and one folded sheet, its wax seal split with age, marked across the outside in a broad, plain hand, "For whoever opens the stair." Nell broke the last of the wax with fingers that would not stay steady and unfolded it and read it there on the cold floor by the swinging lantern. "My name is Harlan Pettit," it began. "I was born in Pennsylvania in 1822 and came out to this country a young man with a strong back and an empty pocket and no more sense than the Almighty hands out to most. I raised this house in 1856, and I kept a table in it near 40 years, and in all that time I never once turned a cold man from my door for want of the price of a bed, which is a thing I set above every dollar in that stairway. Whatever the world made of a man who died looking poor. Whoever you are, read this by whatever light you've got. The money under my stairs is no treasure. It never was one. It's only what I couldn't bring myself to spend, laid by a little at a time, and it did me not 1 hour of good shut up in the dark, while I went gray and solitary above it. I always said I was keeping it towards something. In 40 years, I never once named something. There's my whole mistake, set down plain, and I've had a long time in this emptied town to learn it by heart. I fed this whole valley and never once set a place at my own table for myself. 40 years I gave strangers a reason to come down to breakfast, and I never found the one that would have got me down the stairs on my own. Don't do as I did. Don't spend your life keeping a warm room for everybody but yourself. You came into my house for a reason, whoever you are. Maybe you wanted a place to stand in this world. Maybe you were building towards something. Maybe you were only lost, as I was lost, and stayed lost a deal longer than a soul should. I was every one of those, once. I hope this serves you the way I never let it serve me. The money is not the point of it. It was never anything but the key. What counts is the door it opens, and that you walk through and lay a place at your own table and sit down. The house is honest and sound, and she'll stand another 100 winters if you keep her roof tight and her table set. Some houses are like that. Some lives could be, if we'd let them. Harlan Pettit, his own hand. April, 1874. Nell read it through twice. Then she folded it small and held it in her lap and sat a long while in the cold hush of the house the old man had built and kept and died alone inside, and her mind went to Delia rolling pie dough on a Monday and gone by Sunday. To a 7-year-old on the 4th stair with a slate, running a house in her head years before anyone would let her run one for real. To old Mrs. Yost with her walnut knuckles, saying the trade was giving a man a reason to come down to breakfast. And it went to Harlan Pettit, 30 years in the ground, the best table in the district, who'd given a whole valley of strangers a reason to come down and never found his own, who died solitary, over a stairway full of gold he'd never let himself want, and left the reading of it to her. And she understood, sitting there, the thing she would carry the rest of her days, that the coin under the stairs was the least of what the old man had left her. He'd left her a table to set, and a warning and a reason. The money wasn't the treasure. It was only ever the key. By the following summer, the boarding house was a different building, and Nell Ambrose was a different woman. She did it properly, the way Mrs. Yost had beaten into her. A thing done right, the once outlasts a thing done fast a dozen times over. A little of the gold went to the work. The rest sat banked down at the county seat, and she drew on it only as the house asked. She had the failed ridge stripped and resheathed and shingled tight against the panhandle snow. She jacked the dipped porch roof back to level and set 2 new posts under it. Turned from a cedar booth helped her fall, the pale new wood, raw and sweet, against the weathered old. She pulled the rotted entry floor and laid it fresh in clean planed fir, every board fitted to walk true underfoot. She scraped and puttied and painted the whole broad front of the house a warm, ordinary white, and hung the shutters back straight, and set the front windows glinting for the first time in 30 years. She blacked the great range and drew its dampers right, and got it, drawing sweet, and she scrubbed the long table down through 30 years of dust to the honey-colored wood beneath, and she oiled it, and she set out 20 chairs. She kept the cupboard under the stairs, never filled it, never papered it back, fitted it instead with a little plank door on a leather hinge, so the old hiding place became a proper cupboard where she stowed the good preserves. She kept one empty box, too, the one lettered 1856. The year the house went up, and stood it on the mantel with the old man's letter folded inside, beside the length of black walnut she'd carried since Wallace. She hadn't remade the house. She'd brought it back. Those are different things, and the difference is the whole heart of the matter. Ferris warmed to her by inches, the way high mountain towns do. Curiosity first, then neighborliness, then, one plain morning, the settled sense that she was one of them, which is the costliest regard such people give, and the slowest earned. Booth's wife, a spare quick woman named Marta, took to bringing a crock of huckleberry preserves up the hill of a Sunday, and would not hear of pay. "You eat, Flicka," she'd say. "You are too thin for our winters." An old powder monkey named Cobb, who'd shot rock in the mine in the good years, and known Harlan Pettit to say good evening to, took to the bench by her front door of an evening, and gave her, piece by piece. The man nobody else remembered. The school teacher over in the next camp he'd meant to marry for 15 years and never asked, the yellow Tom named Fergus that had owned the kitchen a dozen years and lay buried now under the lilac by the well. Nell wrote it down, some of it, in a little book she kept in the box on the mantel, piecing together a man she'd never met from the scraps that outlived him. And she opened the house, not the roaring 3-shift house of the boom that Ferris was 30 years dead and would not wake, but a table again, the only warm one at the top of a quiet street. Word ran down the gulch and out the timber roads that the young woman in the old Pettit house set the best supper in the valley, and would stake a cold traveler to a night's grace, and remember his name when he came back through, honest and open-handed as old Pettit himself. And they came, a surveyor benighted on the grade, a widow and her boy moving down to the flat, 2 old miners with nowhere left, a drummer, glad past saying to find a lit window at the top of a dead street. Nell took each one in the way her mother would have, seized him at the door in a single kind look, and set him a place, and gave him, above the bed and the plate, the one thing the trade is really for, a reason to come down in the morning. Some who came to her door were about at the end of their rope. She fed them anyway. A true boarding house keeper doesn't know another way to be. And she did the thing the old man never had. Every night of that first winter, when the boarders were served and the plates cleared, Nell set one more place, her own, at the head of the long table, and sat down and ate her supper in her own house among people glad of the warmth. It was a small thing. It was the whole of it. It was the one place Harlan Pettit, in 40 years, had never let himself lay. One evening, in the long gold of a late summer dusk, she sat on the front step she'd rebuilt with her own two hands and watched the light go amber down the length of the gulch, the yellow Tom's grand kitten dozing warm against her hip, and she turned it all over. Her mother, who could make a stranger feel he'd come home to a place he'd never been and who'd shown her the whole shape of her life before she was old enough to read it. Mrs. Yost, with her walnut knuckles, who'd taught her that a boarding house is a promise and the trade is a reason to come down to breakfast. And Harlan Pettit, 30 years under the lilac-scented ground, who'd kept that promise to a whole valley of strangers and forgot to keep it to himself, who'd learned the last and simplest thing too late for it to save him, and left it under the stair for the one who came after. There's a pull that runs deep in a few of us, older and quieter than any reason we could give for it, long before we've the words to name it at all. We can't always say why we want the thing we want, nor where the wanting is bound to take us. But it's real, that pull, and followed far enough it tends, in the end, to set you down somewhere. For some, somewhere is a place they were born into. For others, it's a place they have to go and find. 2 valleys north, through a shrieking door, behind a papered seam under a staircase that 30 years of a whole town swore was nothing but wall, a place that everyone else gave up on long ago. What the place is doesn't matter in the least. What matters is whether you can stand inside it, set a table, lay a plate at the head of it for yourself, and know at last that you are home. Something that says, without a word, "Here, this is the place. This is where I begin." Nell Ambrose was 22 years old and had nowhere to sleep. $10 in mixed coin to her name, and she spent it on a dead boarding house a whole town swore was worthless. Best $10 she ever laid down, and not, when all was reckoned, for the gold under the stair. For the door it opened, and the long table she set, and the seat at the head of it she finally, in a lonely old man's memory, took for her own. If this one moved you tonight, subscribe to the channel and pass it to someone who could use it just now. And tell us down in the comments, where's the seat at your own table you've been too busy or too afraid to sit down and take? We read every last one, and we'd love to hear it. See you in the next one.